Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Henry, the Robert A. and Elizabeth Rohn Jeffe Chief Curator and Deputy Director at the Museum of the City of New York. And welcome to the latest installation of Curators from the Couch. I'm here, this is my couch. And I am joined by two of my museum colleagues, Curator Dr. Lilly Tuttle and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Postdoctoral Curatorial Fellow, Dr. Monxo López. That's a mouthful, always. Hi. Each on their respective couches or couch equivalents. And over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be talking about the Museum of the City of New York's award-winning 3-gallery exhibition, New York at its Core, which opened in 2016. And today we're going to have a special focus on the second gallery, called World City, 1898 to 2012, which Lilly and I co-curated in collaboration with our amazing team of Dr. Stephen Jeffe and the late Dr. Hilary Ballin, and with the input of an all-star scholarly advisory committee who helped us to put together this story of New York in the 20th century. And we're going to be thinking about how the show resonates today, 4 years after its opening. So you're seeing some slides of this now. I want to give you a little bit of background for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to experience the exhibition in person. It was 5 years in the making. The 3 galleries of New York at its Core are framed around a single question: what makes New York, New York, which you saw on a previous slide. And our answer to that question is distilled down to just 4 words: money, density, diversity, and creativity. And the exhibition brings New York's history to life through amazing artifacts and images and also stories. Right now you're seeing some of the faces of the people featured in the exhibition, which include immigrants, politicians, dreamers, everyday New Yorkers, artists, everybody from Alexander Hamilton to Jay-Z. And so today, as I said, we're taking a look back at the exhibition almost 4 years after it opened in 2016 and thinking together a little bit about how it looks maybe different in the light of the events of the past months. So let's dive right in. And I wanted to start with Lilly, since she and I put together the World City exhibition. And we really geared it around the story of the roller coaster of the 20th century. A century that was really marked by repeated crises and reinvention. And given that we're now in a new moment of 21st century crisis and crises, what do these 20th century stories about New York in moments of crisis say to us today? So Lilly, I just wanted to start with you to reflect a little bit about how did we go about curating some of these past low points / crises in the history of New York in the 20th century?
Sure. That's a great question, Sarah, and I have been thinking about it a lot myself. So what we really tried to do is allow our visitors to understand that even in moments of crisis, even in moments that feel like the city is despairing socially and economically, there are kind of bright points. There are things that can forever transform the city for the better. Given that one of our keywords is creativity, we wanted to think about how creativity can manifest in a lot of different ways across the 5 boroughs. So, for example, here you're looking at 2 side-by-side images of cases, which actually in the gallery sort of face each other. I like to say that each niche in the gallery in World City, it covers about a decade, maybe 15 years. And it's really one time period told 2 different ways. And so in our moments of crisis, what we tended to do was say, okay, this is the crisis. This is the moment of despair. This is when New Yorkers are out of work. Neighborhoods of color like Harlem are particularly hard hit during the Depression. There's a sense of hopelessness. There's a sense of, just the feeling that the promise of New York and the promise of the skyscraper era is completely empty. So we see that on one side of the gallery, and we have some wonderful art and artifacts that tell that story. But on the other side, facing you, is a section called New York's New Deal, where we highlight the fact that New York, the country at this time was really led by New Yorkers. Roosevelt was a New Yorker. Many of his key cabinet members were New Yorkers. And our mayor at the time, Fiorello LaGuardia, had a really great relationship with the president. And so we look at all of the infrastructure plans, the parks, the pools, the roadways, schools, hospitals. This is the era when master builder Robert Moses begins really making an impact on the city. And we say that while the New Deal didn't really end the Great Depression, it provided us with a thoroughly modern city that we continue to live with, and many wonderful public amenities that really transformed New York for the better. So that's the 1930s story, is looking at the legacy of the New Deal, looking at the public works and the infrastructure, and seeing how it in so many ways gave us the city that we live with today. So in the 70s, it's a very similar approach that we took. We sort of want to tell the story. So on the left side here, you have an image of a case called On the Brink, where we say this is the moment that many people might know from a lot of popular culture. There's a lot of popular memory about this era. It's Mayor Beam holding up the headline that says "Ford to City Drop Dead." It's the era of David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. It's the era of the Bronx is burning, which is a little bit of myth here, but that there were many fires in the Bronx and in Brooklyn at this time. And just a sense in which New York was really teetering on the brink of catastrophe. But then because we wanted to look at creativity, and we wanted to look at the fact that whenever New York seems to be in a moment of crisis and change, there can be really interesting things that come out of that. And so we, on the facing case called Against the Odds, we looked at some of the creative innovations that came out of this time period of the late 1970s, most notably hip hop, which was sort of born in the parks and rec rooms of neighborhoods in the Bronx and elsewhere, and graffiti, which was sort of a really original homegrown form of street art that birthed the careers of a lot of notable New York artists. And then we also looked at nightlife and said that even as, Ford is telling the city to drop dead, and New York has a serious image crisis, and people think that the city is over, somehow there are places like Studio 54 that have made New York City feel very cool and desirable. And, you have people lining up around the block to get in. And, that this in many ways is an era that was really transformative to the culture of New York City, and that there were a lot of creative innovations in terms of music, visual art, nightlife. This is also the kind of post-Stonewall era for LGBTQ culture in New York.
And back, really... Julia, stay on the previous slide.
So we have some images of, this is on the top right of my screen, there's a photograph there by the photographer Lloyd Ziff of an early gay pride parade. So we really just wanted to say that while New York maybe had an image crisis and an economic crisis in the 1970s, there was a lot of really cool, interesting creativity that flourished at this time.
It's interesting because, of course, one of the challenges of the entire New York at its core project was how to distill this enormous, complicated story down into very finite space, and also to tell the story visually. So we had to practice this discipline of radical selectivity to say we couldn't tell all the stories, but to tell ones that could be communicated visually and that would capture the spirit of the time without diminishing the complexity. But I remember when we were working on this, I think I was aware there was sort of a nostalgia for the 1970s, like when space was affordable and artists could have room, and you could come as an aspiring person to New York and arrive, and there was space for you. And I sort of note that now, as we're going through this current crisis, there's a kind of nostalgia, but also a little fear. Like there's a lot of hope riding on the idea that creativity came out of the 70s to hopefully maybe counterbalance some of the the gravitational pull down that we're feeling right now. And I'm thinking about Monxo. You joined the museum just about a year ago, and the show had been up for 3 years. And then we got hit by our twin crises, and you're looking at these, back at this case of the 70s, and sort of between where Lilly and I were when we started it, and then where we are finding ourselves as a city. And I wonder if that nostalgia resonates for you, or does it strike you as problematic?
I think it's both. I think it makes sense to be nostalgic because of the wealth of creation that happened at that time. But myself living in the South Bronx, although I'm in a couch in San Juan in Puerto Rico, that there is also fear, and it's understandable. I think that when I looked at this at the exhibit when it opened, and then I took a very deep look at it when I came into the museum. I never imagined that we will find ourselves in a crisis like this. There's always this sense that these types of crisis and tragedy that happened to people, before us, that's not going to happen again, and then it did happen again. And what I find comforting in a way is that amidst this narration of New York as a place that survives crisis, and it's like a metronome of rhythm there. We can talk later about if there is a pattern or not. That it's very important that you all included the concept of creativity there and of diversity, because it is out of that we can find some hope about where to move forward as a city. And I think that the neighborhoods of this city in all these different crises that Lilly was talking about, like they saved the city and they saved themselves. Obviously, we always need help. It is a particularly frightful time right now with the threat coming from the White House of sending federal nobody really knows.
No one knows. Let's build on that a little bit. And Julius, if you can go forward to the next slides, because one of the things I always think about when we talk about that period, and then the really remarkable turnaround that then gets narrated in the next 3 cases. So what we're looking at here are the section that looks at the 1980s and 1990s. And I always tell people when we go into the gallery that it's like a dizzying transition, going from a period when a lot of people felt like the day of the city, and of New York City in particular, was over, that you didn't really need cities, that they were a early mid 20th century thing, and the 21st century wouldn't need them, to going to a place where less than a generation later, New York, at the time we curated the show, was feeling in some ways that we were having too much success. There was too much demand, too much concentration of wealth. The city was too magnetic, and edging people out. And we divided the question of how we got from A to B. We divided into 3 sections. On the left here, you see one that's called New York Comes Back, with a question mark that looks at the role of business and particularly finance and so on in the supercharged 1980s and 1990s. On the right, to build on Monxo's point, is the section on the new immigrant city, as the immigration reform of the mid-1960s really begins to be felt, and the diversity that we understand today really gets constructed, and all that immigrant entrepreneurship and revival of neighborhoods is on view there. And then if you go forward one other slide to something that's echoes eerily today, is a section that we called A Safer City, and there's a question mark there, which is, how did New York go to become what was considered the safest big city in the United States after having been racked with crime? It was called Fear City in that 1970s case that Lilly was talking about. And the complicated story of policing and of cleaning up, quote unquote, neighborhoods like Times Square and others, and kind of what does that safety, what cost does it come, and what are its benefits? And then, of course, the singular event of 9/11 is also portrayed here. So we get this this encapsulated story of this turnaround New York underwent in the 80s and 90s. And I wanted to ask both of you whether you think there are any lessons of that turnaround that we think might be valuable to us now as we look ahead to the unknown for New York?
Yeah, so I think if we can go back to the previous slide, I'd love to point a couple things out about these two cases. So number one, in this case called New York Comes Back, as we tell our time period two different ways, we actually in the case on the left here, we even tell this time period two different ways, because we do talk about the new Gilded Age and the idea that Wall Street is really booming at this time, and New York City has made a pretty robust recovery in its painful transition from an industrial city to a service economy, and sort of the decline of the port and manufacturing has given way to a pretty robust white-collar economy. But that is not to say that this is a shift experienced by all New Yorkers equally. And so we have a section called Tale of Two Cities, where we have some photographs and artifacts that reflect the gentrification and the extreme crisis of homelessness that racked the city at this time. And I did want to point out that we have a photograph on view, a black and white photograph on the right here by Margaret Morton, who recently passed away and was such a friend to this project, and her works are in the collection. And she did a really, really stunning series on Tompkins Square Park in the 1980s, which was a very challenging time for that park. But then I also wanted to speak in terms of today's contemporary relevance beyond that of how we're thinking about New York and how we come back out of this particular moment, and what our vulnerabilities are in terms of what were our strengths 30 years ago and or 40 years ago now. And I think it's about small businesses. I think that we need to remember that in the period when the full diversity of New York came into bloom in the 1980s, we focus on neighborhoods in Queens and in South Brooklyn, when the five boroughs got a whole new host of Chinatowns and, immigrant neighborhoods that were really driven by small businesses. And we have a great before and after picture of one block in Corona and how transformed it was, even in 20 years' time. And I think that we just need to remember that those small businesses are just the bedrock of some of these communities and their economies. And, we feel so proud and so energized by that in the exhibition, and that we can't lose sight of, our restaurants and our coffee shops and all that they do for our communities.
And that those people were coming to New York at a time when it was widely seen that New York was being abandoned.
Right, and they stepped in,
yeah.
And they came, and they were creative and entrepreneurial, and it was utterly transformative to those neighborhoods and to the city as a whole. And so we need to not lose sight of that.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to look at the last section of the exhibition. Just if we can flip ahead 2 slides, because we had to think about the post 9/11 city, and kind of the last gallery of the exhibition is called the Future City Lab, and we wanted to transition people to the future. And this case looks at what we're calling debating the city, and it's from 2001 to 2012. And it's really the Bloomberg years and all the transformations that took place during that time. It strikes me, looking at it, so much of it is about density and how to make density livable in the city. And density is such a topic of conversation in the COVID era. And that I kind of want to look at this afresh and think about it afresh. But we deal with things like the bicycle city and the developer city with development of Hudson Yards, and also some of the great strife that's going on. You can see little glimpses of the 2008 financial crisis and Occupy Wall Street. And there's always that tension, that polarization, that yin yang in all of the sections that we're talking about in this exhibition. And here you have that kind of double vision. And it's interesting to look back at it from this perspective 4 years later. And I wonder what it looks like to you, like Monxo, because you came to the project after we were already done with it. If we had it to do again, would we make the same choices about talking about the quote unquote present?
Yes, I think that a lot of what you did here, in a way, speaks to neighborhood memories, like in all different neighborhoods in the city. There are memories about frightful times, but also about the hopes and potential of these different communities that come together as a city. And when I look at this, I identify those memories. These are things that are still with us. Like a lot of what we are seeing today with the Black Lives Matter and the form, the shape that it takes, particularly in New York City, harkens back directly to Occupy Wall Street, and a lot of the fear with overdevelopment, with displacement and whatnot, is a very, very long and very old conversation. And to understand, when you go to the gallery and you understand and you see that many of these conversations and many of these debates, acrimonious debates, have been happening for a long, long time, I think that one of the lessons is that you look around, you see that the city is still there, that we are all still here, and that we need to make it out in one piece or as much as possible, and that even activism, it's so in a way dependent and to the wealth of the city, that activism pushes back against some of this overdevelopment and capital and whatnot, that there is no way of having one without the other. And I think that idea that we see today of canceling, movements and canceling people and whatnot, of course, that's something that is needed at certain points, but that we need that we've made it out as a city, and that we have the activism that we have, and that we have the type of capital that we have, the capitalism and the type of city that we have, because of the push and pull between these two poles. Like there is in a case, the title "A Tale of Two Cities," of two cities. It is there, and at the end, it makes one. But we need to really look at the history, because if not, I think that particularly at a moment like this, we can easily fall into despair. It's nice to see that this has been going, nice and hopeful and frightful that this has been going on for so long.
It's interesting to hear you make those connections back, and also looking at this case and realizing that the content here is less than 10 years old, or 10 to 15 years old, but it feels very historical and resonant, like that it's part of the backstory to what we're going through now. And it just reminds us all, I know this is on all of our minds, because we're working on a project now on documenting the events of 2020 under the hashtag COVID Stories NYC and hashtag Activist New York, looking at the uprising against police violence and the coping and the struggles under COVID. We're inviting people to submit images. We're going to be curating content from that. But I think even more, for us as a museum, we're going to be adding to the stories that we're able to tell through our collection, and hopefully to be able to offer to the future curators content to give them context for the next struggles of the city. And it's amazing how quickly things that are of the moment become the history, and that time just keeps moving on. So Robin,
I wanted to ask you.
Go ahead. Yes, go ahead and ask.
Yeah, very fast. Like, why can you talk about why did you end the show in 2012 with Hurricane Sandy, and the possible alternatives that you consider at that time?
Go ahead, Lily.
Yeah, that's such a great question, Monxo. And to be honest, whenever I have the great fortune to give tours of New York at its core in person in the gallery, which is one of my favorite parts of my job, I actually ask my visitors at the outset, why do you think we ended at 2012? What a random year. And so to explain a little bit, we actually did a few rounds on and debated, like New Yorkers do, when did the 20th century in New York City end? And so in our original iteration and periodization of this gallery, we said that the 20th century ended on September 11th, 2001. And so we said 9/11 was the break point. But then when we thought about it some more, we realized that 9/11, as devastating and tragic and catastrophic as it was not something that necessarily altered the DNA of the city. That where there was some, sort of economic rebound and physical rebound, and so we then said, okay, it's 2008. It's the fall of Lehman Brothers. It's the economic crisis. And then we said, well, again, Wall Street came back, and we're sort of like that thing of New York City. We say now, we're resilient doesn't even begin to sum it up. So Hurricane Sandy in 2012, to my mind, was a way to highlight some of the existential questions and sort of really fundamental issues with our waterbound geography, because we deal with water all through this exhibition. The first gallery is called Port City. And we dealt very much with the fact that under the Bloomberg administration, there was a great deal of waterfront revitalization and building. And so when Sandy came, not only was it physically, socially, economically devastating, it also raised some very serious question about New York City's future in this age of climate change and rising sea level. And so we do have a third gallery called the Future City Lab. And so it just, to my mind, made for a great dovetail into examining the questions of the future of New York, how we build, how we grow, and yet have a sustainable city in this era of great climate crisis. So that, my friend, is why we ended with Hurricane Sandy. But it's interesting, the farther we get from 2012 and the younger my visitors are, there's like, I have to explain it. So it's fascinating to me, but that's my answer.
So Robin, did we want to?
Yeah, so we had a couple of questions from social media. Chris said that their favorite objects in the exhibition are the Fear City pamphlet and the Studio 54 guest list, and wanted to know if there was any information about, how you came across those objects and got them into the exhibition. And even if, you don't have specific stories on those, I'm sure you have some great stories about some of the objects, so maybe you could just share those.
That's such a great superfan question. Thanks, Chris. All right, Lily, you should answer, because those are your objects.
I love to tell the story of the Studio 54. There's the guest list. Okay, I have to limit myself. Okay, so there's the guest list, which is actually part of our collection at the Museum of the City of New York. And it's a handwritten guest list, totally analog. No one was on an iPad. There was no open table or anything like that. They just wrote down your name. And if you flip through it, there are some names on there, particularly if you're of a certain generation, names like David Bowie, Liberace, that will jump out at you. I think David Bowie brought 20 guests that night. So he was rolling real deep. And then the Studio 54, there is a little silkscreen ticket there that was below it. We don't have it on view anymore, but that came from the New York Public Library, and it was actually silkscreened by Andy Warhol as kind of a gag gift for his friend Truman Capote. And he signed the back of it, and he said, "To Truman, love, Andy," because Truman spent so much time in the VIP lounge. And then the Fear City brochure actually was a wonderful loan from the Brink College Archives. And just very quickly, that was a brochure that was created by the police union to protest against cuts to the police force in New York City, and basically saying, welcome to Fear City. Due to these cuts, we will not be able to protect you any longer on the streets of New York. And they handed them out at tourist destinations and in Midtown. It made it look really scary.
Are there any other objects that are your all's favorite in the show? I think that was another question we got, and something I'm personally curious about too.
It's always like asking to choose among your children, which I do not do. There are so many great things. I think one of the interesting things is the ways in which something that's very ordinary can become, a museum artifact. Like we have beautiful things like, fine artworks in there that are really extraordinary. And then some things are more ordinary. I mean, since we're talking about people who passed away, who helped with this exhibition, I will say it's no longer on view because it could only be on view for a short time from the Museum of Modern Art. But we did have the original Milton Glaser sketch for the I Heart New York campaign. And we put that in the 1980s section as part of that idea of investing in the city and the state. And it was literally scribbled on the back of an envelope. Like, it's an envelope or a napkin, Lily? An envelope.
Napkin.
A napkin.
Napkin.
And it's just got his handwriting scribble. It shows where things that can become so iconic start just as a germ of an idea. And that was an incredible thing to have on view. I mean, there are other things like from our collection, our amazing costume collection. Al Smith's Brown Derby, which symbolized his campaign, his kind of populist immigrant-based campaign, was an amazing thing to have on view. But I don't know, Lilly or Monxo, do you have things that jump out at you?
When you come to the gallery for the first time, the World City, it's noisy compared to the previous gallery. And so for me, for example, there is a soundtrack there of salsa singer Cheo Feliciano. It's a live recording that they did at the Yankee Stadium, and Cheo died here in New York City. I grew up listening to in Puerto Rico. I mean, I grew up listening to him, and when you come in there, when I go in there and I hear him, and all this noise that is so distinctive of New York is really shocking, particularly with coming from the other previous gallery.
We really want
like
to make the
much.
20th Century Gallery move and breathe and live and have some of that raucousness of the 20th century, and take advantage of the fact that there's recorded sound and moving images. So I'm glad that that touches you. Great. All right, great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. I think we could talk about our favorite objects for a long time, Lilly.
Yeah, I could go on.
But that sadly does bring us to the end of this installation of Curators on the Couch. And as a reminder to everybody, you can go to the museum's website to view some elements of the exhibition, New York at its core, and learn more about it. So I really want to thank Monxo López and Lilly Tuttle for this great conversation, and to my colleagues at the museum behind the scenes and occasionally popping up on the screen for all the work that went into the Curators from the Couch program. And we do have another one coming up, so I want to encourage you to join us on August 6th at 1:30. And that's going to feature a conversation between our curator of prints and photographs, Sean Corcoran, along with graffiti artists John Crash Matos and Lee Quinones, who will be talking about our traveling exhibition, originally at the museum, called City as Canvas, and about the current resurgence of street art in New York. And we also have some amazing free virtual programs that are coming up. So definitely mark your calendars. On July 28th at 5, we have our pre-doctoral fellow, Dan Ewert, who's going to look at the very fraught history of fingerprinting and criminal background checks in pre-World War II New York City. On July 29th at 6:30, we have a program that I think will really resonate with people about New York's communities of color and the police, a historical perspective. So we have some history of this in the gallery we just discussed, but this is really going to do a deep dive in a panel discussion moderated by TV veteran Carol Jenkins, with scholars who will be talking about how communities of colors have experienced and responded to the police in 20th century New York. So, and to build on Monxo's point, some history that can help us contextualize what we are experiencing now. On August 3rd at 7, we're doing Moonlight and Movies, which is going to feature a conversation with filmmakers about New Yorican Basket, which is the story of Puerto Rican national basketball team and its participation in the 1979 Pan American Games. And then also for families, on Wednesdays, tune in at 10 we have an ongoing free crafting series with Project Kid that you can enjoy and follow along with at home. And so I know I just gave a whole mouthful, so you want to find out about these events for any of our exhibitions, our collections, our programs, please go to mcny.org. Please join our email list and follow us on social media. And please feel free to share the link for this conversation and everything that we do with your circles. So thank you. Thank you both, Lilly and Monxo, and see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.